This is a bright orange star known as Aldebaran, sitting around 65 light-years away from our sun, and here it is in my light-polluted sky. This star is 44 times the size of our own sun, and sits in the constellation of Taurus. A constellation known since the early Bronze Age, it was often thought of as the Bull of Heaven, a mythical beast fought by the hero Gilgamesh, and according to Assyriologists Jeremy Black and Anthony Green, Enkidu hurled the bull's thigh at Ishtar in the Epic of Gilgamesh after defeating it, which may explain why the constellation seems to be missing its hind quarters, as if the constellation missing a part of itself is quite important. And this is Aldebaran, otherwise known as one of the three great mysteries of the series, who is also missing a piece of himself in more ways than one. When you first see him, you might not really think much of him, and then he drops one of the biggest bombshells this early on in the series. He too is from Japan. And that isn't just for mystery's sake or some cool world building, but it's also used to contrast with Subaru's expectations, who early on in the series had all of these preconceived notions about his status in this world by virtue of being isekai'd, and then he meets Al, who was more or less unimpressive, and missing an arm, and certainly not running the show like Subaru expected to. It's one of the many reality checks Subaru receives in that arc, and sets up Al as someone we will definitely watch with great interest, unless you're an anime only. Our second meeting with him would then increase our suspicions about him drastically, after Subaru gets his ass kicked by Priscilla, and she calls for Aldebaran, as much as he dislikes being called by his full name, who takes him back to Rem. He would mistake Rem for Ram, and when Rem would correct her, Al would stop in his tracks, suddenly sounding nervous and fiddling with his helmet. He would ask if Ram was alive, and the instant Rem gave him his answer, a low, cold voice came from his helmet, telling her this ain't funny. As Rem and Subaru leave, Al watches them leave and mutters to himself, "You gotta be joking me." So that's what it was. Makes me want to puke. This incident alone leaves us with a question that hangs in almost everybody's mouth. Just who is Aldebaran? Well, we really don't have a whole lot to work with. 36 volumes deep and with multiple side stories, we are still learning basic details about him. He rarely, if ever, speaks of his pre-isekai life, besides the occasional reference to his parents or the fact that he is an only child, and he was transported around the age of 18, and beyond that, we're left in the dark. There's this big gap of time between Al being brought here that we don't know about, and the earliest version of Al that we can experience is him in EX5, an official supplementary novel that describes Priscilla's childhood and Al's time as a gladiator, and he's not exactly the Al we're familiar with. I wouldn't say Al is known for being upbeat and optimistic, but the Aldebaran that sits on this island is entirely dejected, hopeless, and has completely and utterly given up. He describes himself as the picturesque conservative, refusing to take advantage of the uproar on the Gladiator Island caused by Ubilk and his plot on Vincent Valachia's life, because he was satisfied with the living conditions he currently had and spoke about how much worse it could get. The place that took his arm, the place that regularly puts him into forced combat, and the place that makes him look back at the bad stars that put two unlucky competitors in the arena where he must survive. This place is good enough for him. He joins the side of the Gladiator Island and defends it from the uprising, and when asked by Olbart what they could possibly do for him in return, he doesn't really use it as an opportunity to leave. He decides to sit there, even after losing the only person he was on friendly terms with on this island, and rot away for another decade or so. And this seems even worse when compounded by the fact that he can loop. It wasn't as if Al sided with the island because he was afraid of the brutal death that would face him. He was afraid that he would lose even more than he already had. He had completely adjusted to and accepted his horrid life circumstances as a gladiator, repeatedly killing, being killed, and being given the baseline necessities to sustain human life, because when all you know is trauma, you will take any form of stability or mild bump in standard of living with a smile. It's a studied psychological reaction that was seen even in real-world slaves. You are left to imagine just what had Al experienced. How many times had he died? What sort of terrible failure had he experienced that led him to this entirely apathetic state? Al declines leaving the island, deciding to instead accept the bare minimum, to not threaten the status quo whatsoever. And that would be the story of Aldebaran, never knowing more about him or what led him to the situation, or that's where the story should have ended. For some unknown reason, Al fled Ginenhive. A guard helped him slip out and gave him an iron helmet that he recommended selling to afford survival on the outside. The only time we actually see Al post-escape is when he first runs into Priscilla again and becomes her knight. This creates a second gap in our understanding of Al's timeline. Isekai, a big empty space, Ginenhive and the events of EX5, his escape, a smaller empty space, and his encounter with Priscilla. And ever since then, Al hasn't been going purely for baseline survival like on Ginenhive. Something drives him to link up with Priscilla. He acknowledges Ram's existence in Arc 1. Something enrages him when speaking with Rem about Ram still being alive by Arc 3. In Arc 5, he almost feels like an antagonistic force in the background, being accused by Capella of slaughtering the Council of 10 in Pristella, as well as opening the floodgates and for some reason being on Regulus' speed dial on his conversation mirror. He also helps out in the battle in mysterious ways, like by deducing that Typhon drowned here, or giving Beatrice magic stones and telling her to not ask. Subaru is essentially forced to view Al in a negative light, as he is too involved in suspicious activities around the city. It's as if he's privy to information that he shouldn't be privy to, always at the right place at the right time. You know what, that sounds familiar. The point of all of this is, again, how do you go from sitting on your hands in Hive to proactively opening the floodgates, killing the Council of 10, speaking with an Archbishop, and providing people with the tools necessary to win the battle? To make matters more interesting, a bit of that previous behavior from Al seeps out in his conversation with Subaru right before he makes the speech. Something that ReZero excels at is not just immediately fixing characters. You see this with Subaru a lot, and how his negative thought patterns can regularly return. It's especially noticeable in Arc 7, with him thinking about how useless he is and then giving himself a quick slap to get his thoughts in order. Because most of the time, these kinds of issues just aren't that simple to solve. Al speaks out against Subaru's speech, his voice wavering as if clinging to something. He rejects Garfield's label of captain or general for Subaru, implying it's a name that carries too much for him to hold, and he essentially begins projecting onto Subaru. Let's go ahead and examine a couple of remarks from Al, and for the sake of speculation, let's assume he's not talking to Subaru here, but more so talking about himself. Quote, "If only he could just put the whole world on his shoulders and keep on rolling. Now, that would be something to see. Awe-inspiring even. Just what you'd want from the star at center stage. But your average background character can't carry that kind of weight. I can't, and Bro can't either. And now you're forcing him to take on this massive burden. For what?" He tells Subaru to only focus on the person right before him, the one he wants to protect the most, in this case Amelia. Subaru asks him why. Why is he saying this? And Al tells him that he wouldn't even need a reason to pull a kid back to the sidewalk if they wandered out on a red light. He wouldn't even think twice. He is trying to save him from the heroic delusion. You can't afford to lose, you have to win. You'll be fighting while carrying everyone's hopes and expectations, all while leading them to some happy future. If you make that choice now, you'll have to follow through. It's as if Aldebaran has been right here, in this very same situation as Subaru, and knows the pain of the heroic delusion. When you think about it, there's quite a few things that Al and Subaru have in common. They're actually the exact same height, and you know what? They actually have the exact same hair color, and eye color. And you know, they both have the capability of looping, and oh god. If we take into account all of these traits that Subaru and Aldebaran share, clearly they are the same person. Even though they don't sound the same, or have the same magic affinity, or really have the same authority, or really, look alike, and so on and so forth. A lot of ReZero fans love to prop up everyone is everyone theories because Aldebaran is clearly Subaru from the future or something. And it doesn't help that official media will indulge in this kind of thinking by giving an Ifrat Subaru Al's entire getup and missing an arm. Besides those obvious facts I pointed out prior that should make it clear that Al isn't Subaru, there's also just something that's kind of lame about the idea. That and Al equals Flugel, because when you prove he isn't Subaru, this is the next best thing to come. These theories that are contingent on everybody being everybody from a different timeline or future or whatnot seems to ultimately miss some of the primary themes of the series. In a series where the protagonist has the power to literally go back to checkpoints after death, there is a fundamental message of bucking fate and fighting for a particular future, not a predetermined one. This is my biggest complaint about the usual Subaru equals Flugel theories, because Subaru, doing all of this work to shift the timeline to get one that works best for him and his friends, but ultimately leads him to repeating history once again by setting up the world for the next Subaru, kind of goes directly against all of that. Al being Subaru or Flugel is much the same, a character brought from the future to ensure that ultimately the end goal doesn't change, and that these characters can follow their predetermined paths. Subaru's determination to fight and be the change he wishes to see in this world should come from him and his friends, not an outside determinist source. I also think Al just serves the narrative way better as just a foil to Subaru, rather than being literally him. Imagine taking two characters that have both realized that they are not #him, and then going, actually, they are the reason this entire plot started, and with timeline shenanigans. These two characters, if either of them are doing this, would make them literally the most important people. Period. A far cry from their roles in Arc 3. This theory also leaves one of ReZero's quintessential points out to dry, and that's identity. A ton of characters in this story struggle with a sense of identity. Subaru has had a metric shit ton of internal battles when it comes to how he is perceived and how he feels he is. Even going to modern ReZero with things like Natsumi Schwartz, and how he wants to put on the show of being a hero, but to do so he can't be himself. The struggle of Abel and Vincent, with Abel acting as a literal mask for Vincent's actually deeply caring side that he refuses to show until Chish's death, Yorna and Iris, with Yorna having lived life after life and having to come to terms with that when met with the undead Ugard, Priscilla and Prissa and the complicated feelings that are starting to prop up for Priscilla and Vincent, and so much more. To strip away these internal battles from these characters and attribute it to, oh, actually, they just become an entirely different human being is kind of lame. To take Subaru and his recognition of other people's autonomy and turn him into Flugel or Al, who seem like complete polar opposites of him as a person, all for the grand plot, would be a massive disappointment. In the side story, The Scarlet League, Al and Heinkel have a discussion. Heinkel is a very important character for Al to talk with, as the burden of being an Estrella rests very heavily on his shoulders, a name he never feels like he can live up to, and wrestling with his own sense of self along the way. While having a conversation, Al tells him that it's complicated for dudes their age. Men are always going through puberty. Problems keep piling up as we get older, but deep down, it's the same basic stuff. In the end, we're still asking ourselves, who am I? It's like we're stuck in the eternal adolescence. As everyone online speculates as to who Aldebaran really is, if he's Subaru, Flugel, Subaru's dad, Subaru's long-lost brother, or Chamov, and so on and so forth, Al himself doesn't really know either. He, like many other characters, is in an eternal battle for a sense of self, constantly battling with this complacent, defeatist mindset that lies dormant within himself, while still standing up when it matters most, like during Phase 5 of Arc 7. When it came time to save the people of Chaos Flame, his legs trembled, his sword quivered, but he stood up all the same. The helmet he wears forces a barrier between the world he lives in and the man underneath. It's as if with this on, he can justify not being Aldebaran. You might have wondered why I thought Heinkel and Al talking was so important. As mentioned, Heinkel is not fully comfortable with being an Estrella. The name carries a lot of expectations, a lot of weight, and in an almost shocking lack of self-recognition, Heinkel always calls Al Aldebaran, against his will, no matter how many times he tells him to cut it out. That name being something he feels he himself cannot live up to, because at the end of the day, Al is not Subaru, Al is not Flugel, Al is Al, and it's really as simple as that. Now, why would Al not be comfortable being called by his full name, Aldebaran? ReZero has a recurring theme that I like to summarize by an Arc 6 chapter title, the hell bearing the name of oneself. It's fairly self-explanatory, something we saw firsthand with how Nubaru was buckling under the pressure of the name Natsuki Subaru, how Subaru as a child couldn't handle the pressure of being a Natsuki, or how Rem is grappling with the preconceived notions the name Rem holds for her in her amnesic state. Something you're likely already familiar with if you are a fan of ReZero is the significance behind the name Aldebaran. As mentioned at the start of this video, Aldebaran is the burning eye of Taurus, its name deriving from the Arabic term for the follower, due to its trailing an object known as the Pleiades' 7 sisters throughout the sky. The Pleiades are an open cluster that, even in very light polluted areas, you can make it out with the naked eye if you know where to look. Being such a visually unique object in the sky, all sorts of cultures have different names for them, like Japan, who refers to them as Subaru. Some people interpret this as Aldebaran hunting the Pleiades, but if you look at the way the stars are laid out and how the constellations are viewed, it's almost as if Taurus is keeping the Pleiades to its back. Taurus is often known as the Bull of Heaven, and in the ancient tale of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ishtar, often represented by the planet Venus or the Morning Star, makes sexual advances on Gilgamesh, someone who is represented by Orion. When he rejects her, she goes to heaven to demand access to the Bull of Heaven from her parents, and if they refuse, she will destroy the gates that keep the dead inside the underworld, raising them as undead that will plague the world. Her parents initially refuse, stating that the bull is too destructive and will result in 7 years of famine, but Ishtar is like, that's okay, I have enough food for that. They eventually give in, and the bull traps hundreds of people upon its release upon the world. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who many speculate is Sirius the Dog Star, seek out to defeat the Hambabu, a person who watches over the back of Taurus to protect his weak spot, otherwise known as the Pleiades. With Hambabu extinguished, Gilgamesh can attack the Bull of Heaven's weak spot, thrusting his sword deep into the bull's neck, cutting out its heart, and Enkidu tore out the bull's right thigh and tossed it towards Ishtar, who had become angry with the end of the reign of Taurus. Gilgamesh, representing Orion, and in ReZero our closest representation for Orion being Betelgeuse, being the star known as Betelgeuse or the Hand of Orion, and Enkidu possibly representing Sirius. The star lore of this encounter is quite interesting, as Taurus and the Pleiades have a very tight-knit relationship looking out for each other, but ironically, that dynamic seems to be flipped on its head in ReZero, with Aldebaran being the one who follows Subaru to the very end. Michael Rice would speculate that the bull may also represent an earthquake, since bulls in general were widely associated with earthquakes in ancient culture, and that would make Al's use of earth magic quite fitting. This is a lot to say. Aldebaran is heavily linked to the mythology of Taurus the constellation, and there might be some quite heavy baggage attached to that, especially considering that Al failed. Another Al and Subaru similarity that I neglected to mention in the previous sections is Al's very obvious connection to Satella. Instead of Subaru's curiosity or sometimes even anger, Al is filled with deep regret and anguish when thinking about or seeing her. During Sunlight on the Water, Al and Priscilla go to a forest that they hear shows you a dead person. He encountered multiple people, however, most of them not dead as far as he knew, all of which he had no issue with cutting down again, until one person came. When Satella stood before him, Al completely froze. He was unable to act, unable to cut her down even after thousands, then 10,000s, and then hundreds of millions of tries. It was futile. His teeth chattered, and he felt like his knees could give out at any moment. Satella appearing in front of him was described as transcending life and death, a blasphemous act against everything that ever existed. Priscilla cuts her down and saves him, and his body begins to shake with raw fury, about to shout at her for doing such a thing. Al has a history with Satella that is filled with despair and regret, clearly having some deep connection with her at some point, to the extent that Priscilla dispelling her illusion filled him with rage. This gives us an idea of Aldebaran's life before Giedenhive, something to fill in that massive gap of time from earlier. It likely doesn't account for it all, but now we know he too was embroiled with Satella, and EX5 gives us a clue into how that time ended right before his time on Giedenhive. When Aldebaran encounters Arakia on Giedenhive, her silver hair dredges up old, terrible memories. Here I am, seeing a silver-haired girl when I'm about to die. Any chance I'm in hell? He shivers. She narrows her eyes at him, asking if her hair is strange, but he shakes his head. I've just got some bad memories about silver hair. It reminds me that I'm a useless piece of trash. There was someone important to me, and I wasn't able to help them when it mattered most. If we loop back to the second chapter of this video and Aldebaran's strange, dejected, and disconnected mentality on Giedenhive, this can completely link the two. One of the overarching plotlines for V0 is Satella's request for Subaru to kill her, which he rejects and tells her that he will save her. Why does she want to die? Well, if we had to guess, it could very well be linked to the authority of Envy, as Returned by Death and Al's territory are likely quite similar to Envy, hence why she was sealed rather than killed, because it's very possible Satella cannot be killed. Aldebaran, likely, wanted to be the hero that could save Satella. It's even more interesting when you think about what Satella's name means in relation to astronomy. The strongest link is satellite, most likely not referring to a man-made satellite, but instead a natural satellite, like the moon, and how they orbit other bodies. Ironically enough, Edmund Hawley in 1718 used Aldebaran as the first star to reveal the motion of what were initially perceived as fixed points in the sky. Studying records of Aldebaran's position in the sky for more than 2,000 years earlier, he found that the star had moved by utilizing the position of the moon. Aldebaran and the moon were two initial bodies utilized in understanding the movement of stars, and eventually, after millions of years, Aldebaran will have moved enough to no longer be the burning eye of Taurus. We can infer that Al's depressive and conservative acceptance on Giedenhive is a result of this failure, and as described by Subaru in the notorious From Zero, is how we know that he had made the hardest choice. The heroic delusion of saving Satella from whatever ails her, leading into utter failure, which then leads into Al making the hardest choice, giving up. A once bright-eyed hero who had the expectations of mythology and others failed his ultimate goal and was determined to live a life of solitude on that distant island. A once burning eye of the bowl of heaven slowly petering out. What made Aldebaran get back up on Giedenhive? Well, we just don't know, and we likely won't know for quite some time. This seems like one of those events that we can't even begin to speculate on until the series gives us a push in a few directions. There are only a couple of directions I can think of that we might have the slightest clue about, and that's Arc 7 Phase 6, showing us something important that even in the most derelict of circumstances, even when Returned by Death is operating on a loveless basis, allegedly, she can turn back the clock to an earlier save point. If we assume that Al has an offshoot of the envy factor, because we have no reason not to despite how badly people want to pride post, it's possible the same thing could apply to his authority, the primary difference being the territory in Returned by Death, being that Al sets his own checkpoints manually, something akin to what Subaru was doing during Phase 6, allegedly. What if Al had also experienced an I know reset, but instead of going back days or weeks, what if he went back even further? I mean, technically we don't actually know how long he went back, but it could explain why he carries knowledge about people that he maybe shouldn't, like Ram supposedly being dead at this point. It's possible he was operating on preconceived knowledge from a failed long-term loop and something had shifted it, causing Ram to stay alive and causing him great frustration in that moment, and that catalyst would be the introduction of another looper. Now, unfortunately for me, this got a lot less likely in Arc 8 Phase 3 because it was heavily, and I mean so heavily that it is impossible to deny, implied that Aldebaran personally knew Echidna. Now, one might immediately pivot back to Al equals Flugel, however, there are a lot of fucking Echidnas, and there are massive blind spots in our understanding of Al that can lead us to believe he's probably encountered her in the modern era, much like Subaru did. I don't know why people discount that. I kept this one in my back pocket for this section, but this is, in my opinion, the most compelling argument that debunks any and all Al equals Flugel or Subaru arguments, and it's the Observers. We're first introduced to them in a little story that has nothing to do with Al called Battle Ballad. There's this one psychopath named Stride Valakia who will seemingly not shut up about them. Specifically, he laments about how the people that inhabit the ReZero world are simply pawns of the Observers, playing along with their games unknowingly, and the Observers having cast roles to play in their miniature gardens. There's a specific word there that I want to pluck out. Roles. If we focus on this terminology, quite literally utilized by a stargazer, it can lead us to a certain conclusion. Al is not Subaru, Subaru is not Flugel, Al is not Flugel. They are three people chosen to play the same role as each other, the role of the Sage, and all three of them represent different parts of playing that role. Flugel, who has potentially finished his job, Subaru, who is in the process of playing the role, and Aldebaran, who failed. Characters that are deeply connected with the concept of the Observers spend a lot of time looking towards the heavens as if paying attention to an audience that sits above everything else. Stride looks towards the sky when it comes time to mock their inhuman machinations. Cecilos regularly makes remarks about leading actors and putting on a show for the audience, and Marioli, another stargazer, would also spend her time looking up at the stars, as if the Observers are a mix of writers and audience members who push the story of ReZero in the direction they desire. And divine protections are one of the many ways that can be done. Using powerful tools like Ode Laguna, they are the stars that shape history, and we have a few examples in the story of them casting general roles, not specific people. We have somebody like Marioli, who passed down the commandment to Tarita because ultimately, it didn't matter who fulfilled the commandment, it matters that it was fulfilled at all. Of course, in the end it wasn't, and we aren't sure what effects it will have on the future of the story, but that is something to think about. There is also one very obvious and notable example of this, that Vincent Valakia that dies there. I wonder which one it is. Those are the words of Chisha Gold before making his decision to die in place of Vincent to usher in the Great Disaster. Upok and Vincent's words make it quite clear. The commandment passed down from the stars wasn't that the Emperor had to die. It wasn't that Chisha Gold had to die. It was that Vincent Valakia had to die. Chisha Gold, who worked tirelessly to understand what makes Vincent tick, could fully paint over himself in his image and take a fatal blow for Vincent to die in his place, something that clearly satisfied the commandment as the Great Disaster immediately began, and is pretty well in line with the idea of playing a character, or a role. Clearly, these commandments are not so rigid, seeking only a particular thing to happen or a particular role to be fulfilled, hence, the Sage. This is likely a role that has been cast 3 times in ReZero, as far as we know anyway, as mentioned prior. We don't really know what Flugel had been up to for the most part, and Subaru is still in progress, but we have a good idea that Al had failed. As Roswell put it to Subaru, quote, "You who have rejected loss and decided to carry everything in your arms will continue to suffer. You will experience wounds that can never be undone, experience loss over and over, and you will rise up for the sake of regaining what you have lost, continuing to add to your invisible injuries. And now that you have rejected the path of the Sage and chosen the path of the Fool, I will never allow you to compromise." To Roswell, who has existed for hundreds of years and had a personal relationship with Echidna, being a Sage includes focusing on a single goal, accepting loss, and protecting a single person. Subaru is likely already on the path of failing what is traditionally a Sage. However, unlike Al, it's likely he won't give up even through the trials and tribulations that ReZero loves to throw at him. Al, too, likely walked the path of the Fool, failing the Observer's expectations of what constitutes a Sage, until his failure to save Satella crushed him. Ironically, current-day Al is much closer to the original description of that Sage role, standing to protect Priscilla no matter what, as if that failure had been etched into his heart. There are a few ways we can interpret the story known as that they gave up on being a following star. My first version is that we are led to believe, due to the title of the side story, it happens during the events with Lip. However, one could also interpret it to be the day that he gave up on Gienenhive. However, the more I thought about it, the more I disagree with this idea. My second interpretation is that he gave up after understanding that he had failed the role of a Sage, failing to protect the one person he cared the most about. Something spurred him back into action, which of course we still don't know about, and while relapsing back into negative and depressive thought patterns, it isn't until Schultz asked him if he is in love with Priscilla that it all clicks into place for him again. It brought him back to thinking about something big in being a Sage, sacrificing so much for a single person, and though he had failed Satella and had become unable to save her, his fixation now rests on Priscilla, who he will do anything to protect and to ensure she becomes the winner of the royal selection. The feelings of love, admiration, and respect all flooding back to him in that moment, and he decided to cast aside the idea of being a following star, following his fate to where the observers had determined, living a life of complacency and having given up on being a sage, bucking what is expected of him, and to perhaps aid in the saving of Satella after all. Al shows very confused emotions after Arc 5 towards Subaru. Despite his warnings, Subaru stepped up where he faltered. He feels a lot of inner turmoil over this. A kid isekai'd at such a young age, with barely any knowledge of this world and so many other similar circumstances, still stepping up to the plate when it mattered most. It's sometime after this in Arc 7, where we see Al completely change his demeanor towards Subaru, backing Natsume into a corner when Subaru's hero complex had already been shattered. It's Al in a complete 180 that reignites that fire within him, to show Rem the amazing hero he really can be. Of course, Subaru's hero complex returning in such a way isn't exactly healthy or good for him, but Al keeps pushing him for his ultimate goal. In Phase 5, he determines to go where Subaru goes, to protect him when he needs to, and in Arc 8, determines to set up the undead capital of Libagana for the return of the hero, potentially working with the witch cult, killing the Council of Ten, stoking the flames of heroism, setting up for his return. Surely, all of it plays into the goal of Aldebaran, the following star. What is that goal? Well, of course, we don't know. My guess, though, is that he sees something in Subaru. We're made to believe that Aldebaran is possibly an antagonistic force, and it's possible that could come to a head someday, where Al is an ends-justify-the-means type guy, something Subaru would never accept when push comes to shove, but I think ultimately, Aldebaran is not a villain. Being a fellow looper, it's possible he has seen what happens when Subaru dies. Perhaps after Satella's arrival at Chaos Flame, he knows that Subaru has been cast as the role of the sage, and recognizes his own internal failure. What Aldebaran's goal now is to lay the groundwork for Subaru the hero, not the sage, to come in and save Satella once and for all, while figuring out along the way what his role in this play is. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe for the funny YouTube algorithm. You can also become a YouTube member, which gives you access to behind-the-scenes content, a badge on comments and livestream chats, as well as the use of emotes and videos before their actual release. You can also check the description for socials like Twitter, where I'm objectively correct all the time, and Discord, where we talk about ReZero, My Hero Academia, Jujutsu Kaisen, and stuff like that. That's about it though. Thank you for watching. See ya.